This is Reworking Work, a video series from Quartz where we go deep with senior executives on the inner workings of their companies. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Reworking Work. Today we have Rajesh Anandan with us. And Rajesh, would you just start off by sharing a little bit about yourself and your company?
Sure. Thanks, Sana. So I'm one of the founders at Ultranauts, which I started with my old MIT roommate almost a decade ago now. And we have been building a different kind of firm. We started the company with a mission to demonstrate that neurodiversity could be a competitive advantage for business. And our theory of change was simply, first, to build a commercially viable, competitive, successful business powered by a truly neurodiverse team, and along the way, reimagine the workplace and work systems and processes so that all brain types could thrive. And the second part of that theory of change was to take everything we've learned about building high-performing neurodiverse teams and share it with other organizations to hopefully shape a more inclusive future of work for everyone. And so that's where we are. We have teammates in 30 states across the US. 3/4 of our team is neurodivergent. We have neurodivergent teammates on the leadership team, HR. So it's not just analysts and engineers. We are a engineering services firm. Our core business is data and software quality engineering. So what we do is technical in nature. We've ended up with arguably one of the more diverse groups in business. So while we are truly neurodiverse, majority of our team is autistic. We have many teammates who are ADHDers, who are dyslexic, dyspraxic. We have teammates who are non-speaking. We have teammates with auditory challenges. We also have teammates that are diverse in many other ways. We have more females than males, including on the leadership team, and we're an engineering group. 1/5 of our managers are Black, a higher proportion than at the entry level. 1/3 of our teammates identify as LGBTQ+. 1/4 of our top performers don't have university degrees. So however you look at the group of humans that have come together at Ultranauts, we're just a group of diverse individuals who have been on this journey, learn how to use our unique strengths and collaborate with teammates who are different to drive value for our clients.
Yes, I love it. You're the definition of reworking work. You are trying to redo the life cycle of an employee throughout the whole way, from hiring to probably offboarding. You're doing things differently. I'm curious, Rajesh, when you think about the neurodiverse, and thank you for defining that for us and showing that long spectrum, what was the motivation to have such a neurodivergent workforce, right? A lot of people are looking at gender and maybe more the more prominent areas of diversity. Why was neurodivergence so important to you and your co-founder?
It's a long, windy story, and I wish we had a neat, linear origin story. But, we were in school at MIT in the early 90s. We didn't have a lot of these labels then. Neurodiversity as a term was coined by Judy Singer, I think in the late 90s. But certainly in gig school, a lot of our friends and close friends even now are neurodivergent. And while it's one thing to be different in an academic setting, generally those settings are much more flexible and tolerant, where curiosity rules the day. The real world is not that. And, we've seen how some of our friends have struggled trying to navigate a society and systems that were just not designed for them, and just the tremendous waste of human potential as a result. And then quite a bit later, I had maybe my first real exposure to what autism is. My wife's a child psychologist, and she was doing work with younger kids who were on the spectrum in the early 2000s, when there was a kind of spike in diagnosis rates. And she came home from work one day and said, we spend all this time focused on things that the kids I'm working with may never be good at, like social or relational skills, et cetera. And it's important, these are important skills to know, but at the same time, no one, not the therapists or the educators, and in some cases, not even the parents, are nurturing the things that kids are already amazing at. And isn't that a shame? And the simple idea of like, what if we could just design around strengths and not penalize people for their differences? What kind of system would we end up in? What could we as a group achieve? And that's the journey we've been on. And so, we're a professional services firm. We provide this data software quality engineering services. We primarily work with large enterprise clients, and it's across a range of industries. So Goldman Sachs, Bloomberg, BNY Mellon, TD Bank, Disney, Comcast, Pepsi, Salesforce. So, and nobody's bringing us in because we're the neurodiverse group. Right. They're bringing us in because they've got a complex data quality challenge, and they need a rigorous and lean and thoughtful approach to solving it. And our teams have been able to consistently do that as a company. And I think our 3-year CAGR, our compound annual growth rate, is probably somewhere over 40%. And we have ups and downs. We're nowhere perfect, but we are showing in very concrete terms that if you can bring together a lot of very different humans and create the conditions for these humans to actually use their unique strengths, but also provide the tools and create the habits that allow that kind of collaboration with colleagues who are very different, then you can do better. You can outperform the market. And the evidence behind cognitive diversity, which is a broader concept that includes neurodiversity being sort of neurotypes, and then you add in different problem-solving styles, different lived experiences, and you end up with cognitive diversity. In the same way that biodiversity leads to more resilient ecosystems that can respond to changes in the environment and thrive, that's the world of business we're all in. And frankly, without cognitive diversity, you end up with groupthink that can be very risky in a dynamic environment. And dynamic is basically the world we're living in now, and the rate of change keeps accelerating. And so most companies are really not going to thrive, never mind survive, unless they can figure out how to create the systems and the practices and habits that allow different perspectives and different brain types and different problem-solving styles to work together.
Does that define this universal workplace? I know that's a goal for Ultranauts and for you, Rajesh. Is that how you define the universal workplace?
The universal workplaces are shorthand, for the aspiration to apply universal design to work systems and work processes, so that we can design for inclusion in a systemic way. And the reason we arrived at this concept was that because our team is so diverse, and it's not just in terms of neurotype or demographics, we over-index on a range of mental health conditions. We have teammates who have severe anxiety or workplace PTSD or complex PTSD. As I mentioned before, we have a lot of different communication modes on our team. We have teammates who are non-speaking, including as lead engineers. And so you could imagine on the same Agile Scrum team, got just a lot of different humans. And so the traditional management playbook just doesn't work. And certainly the DEI practices and activities that have been getting more attention over the last decade didn't work for us. I mean, and maybe, don't work in changing outcomes in general, as we've seen, but so we couldn't even start trying because they, like one-off accommodations for each person on the team. And what is a job accommodation other than a Band-Aid that's covering up for a systemic failure in the organizational design that you're imposing on the individual as their fault, right? Like it doesn't make sense. Or targeted hiring initiatives. how do you target one group over another? What happens is you have a, I'm gonna, loosely make this up, but let's say I have a autistic male job seeker who is living below the poverty line and doesn't have any mental health conditions or kind of communication challenges. Or I have a neurotypical Black female who has severe anxiety. Like how do you, who are you targeting? How do you design? Right. So these kind of point solutions don't work really for anyone, and they just didn't work for us. We couldn't have a mentorship program for this group, right? Or a hiring initiative for this group. Now, all we do differently at Ultranauts is that we do proactively invest in sourcing job applicants from communities, neurodivergent communities of actually autistic adults or ADHD, and professional communities who care about quality engineering. But leaving that aside, what our point of arrival is, everything about our work system should be the same for everyone so that no one has to ask for an accommodation, because as soon as that becomes a requirement, that's a barrier. That's a threshold that a lot of teammates may not get over, because in the past, every time you might disclose, a diagnosis or ask for an accommodation, suddenly that puts you at a disadvantage. And so, no, people don't want to ask for what they need. And so we have to design a system where the system provides people with what they need in order to contribute. We're not an advocacy group. We're not activists. We're trying to get the work done. And so the universal workplace as a point of arrival is a workplace where every team member is able to fully contribute and participate to drive value for that team, whatever the value needs to translate to.
It's a beautiful thought. It's a beautiful thought. And I think it would stay a thought if we didn't operationalize it. And I know, Rajesh, you are super passionate about operationalizing these values, this mission, this vision into action. Can you show, because I'm imagining leaders listening to this right now thinking like, that all sounds really nice. It must take a big upheaval. I know you've already said we simply do our attraction a little bit differently, right? We look for the candidates differently. But I have to think you're probably putting in policies and procedures internally that are supporting that type of diversity of the universal workplace that you're striving for. So can you give us an example of a policy or practice?
Yeah, and I will say, I'll start with the easy part. So talent acquisition, recruiting is where there is a sort of 3 decades of evidence on what works. And yet, most organizations rely on practices that are familiar, that have been proven time and again to have nothing to do with predicting job performance. So what does that mean? Every job posting you've ever seen, except if you look at Ultranauts and a few other groups, will have as a requirement a specific number of years of prior work experience in a similar context, right? So let's just say, and by the way, we go through this every time we have a new hiring manager and we're posting a job. They'll sort of need to insist on, no, I need someone with 7 years of experience. And so then, of course, you're like, well, why 7? Why not 8? Why not 6? Mm-hmm. Right? And so then you can have a meaningful conversation around, well, what competencies or skills or capabilities are you assuming someone has at 7 years? Let's draw those out. Let's define those discretely and create requirements around them. So that's one. So get away from just trying to pattern match the past, because really, even if there was some, magical discrete threshold beyond which you can do the job if you've been doing this, right? Nobody knows if you were doing a good job or not. Let's say you were did you learn anything? Did you grow while you were there for 7 years? What was your starting point? And let's say you actually did grow and you did do a great job. What were the factors in that organization that allowed you to be successful? And do you know if we have the same enabling factors in our organization that would essentially allow you to perform the same? And of course, the answer to all these questions is I have no idea. And so please stop doing that. There's literally no evidence. There was a meta-analysis of kind of the efficacy of recruiting tools done, I think in the late 90s, and nothing's changed since then. And the correlation between specific number of years of work experience and on-the-job performance was an R-squared of like 0.03. And an R-squared of 0 is no correlation. 1 is a perfect correlation. 0.03 is there is no correlation. Stop doing it. All you're doing is limiting the applicant pool of people who probably could do the job, and then doing your due diligence on those that you think just because they've done it before can do it. And so using, just not relying on these crutches that really are not useful is a starting point. Another one is just degrees and certifications, although on that one, we've seen a lot of progress in the last few years, with especially a lot of big tech companies removing requirements for degrees, because you can teach yourself skills in a lot of different ways. It may be that economically you didn't have access to a university experience or have access to the coaching and prep you needed to get to apply for financial aid in an aid-blind school. Or it could be that a campus setting is not an environment that is good for you, where you can actually thrive and learn. There could be so many reasons. So, putting these barriers is just self-limiting, and it's useless. The other is you then get to, once you don't unnecessarily screen out people who could be great at the job, then you get into assessing people. And usually the fallback is step one is an HR screening interview. Why do you need that? What are they actually doing in that interview? Like, really, what are they doing? I don't know. We have an application form people fill out. And essentially, instead of all these like years of work experience, we try to pull out discrete competencies or experience or knowledge that we think the person has to have. And we create yes, no questions around it. And we're presuming trust, right? We're assuming people are going to be honest. It'll show up later at some point if they're not. But we try not to do these, screening calls, because that's an inefficient use of time. Like, you could just ask the person a bunch of questions and get the answer and save everybody time. The second is when we do interviews, they come later in the process where we've already gathered some objective data. So from the application. So the application also means we don't need to look at a resume, because we're not testing for how well can you write a resume and tell your story. We're actually trying to get to what can you do.
Yes.
So, if you need to take a resume writing workshop to be successful in your application process, maybe that's not the right thing to be testing for. But we use job tests. It's a single most predictive thing you can do to assess someone's ability to do the job. So we use job tests for all roles, not just engineering roles. Everyone's like, okay, yeah, you can do a coding challenge for engineers. Yes, but you can also construct a meaningful exercise for recruiters. We might be the only company in the world that hired a VP of sales where they had to take job tests. Because if you can have a convincing conversation, surely you can pass an interview. But that says nothing about your ability to strategically unpack a market opportunity or creatively network your way to senior decision makers. And those are things you can test. You can construct an assignment. So use job tests. And then the final piece is when you do interviews, all humans are biased. It doesn't matter how many anti-bias training workshops you've been through. Unconscious bias is called that because it is unconscious. So you need to put guardrails. One guardrail is have objective data gathered before the interview, and you find your favorite person and you can't let go of this idea that they're going to be perfect, because they won't. The other, though, is have structured interview questions for everyone. Managers will start complaining that, but I want to get to know the person, and that's fine. You can have drill down questions that you go off script, but have the same questions. And importantly, have a scoring rubric that predefines what a good answer is. Again, just put some guardrails around the bias that's very natural that kicks in. So this is the longest winded answer to the question of objective recruiting. There is no reason for it not to be happening, because the evidence is clear. It's literally decades of research backing up very common sense things to do. And the only reason we don't is we, as humans, cling to the habits we're familiar with, and we overestimate our ability to, quote, judge people.
Very, very fascinating from a hiring perspective. I'd love to go into nonverbal if we have time later, but first I want to kind of follow the arc of the life of the employee. If we've talked a little bit about how you're different in the hiring process. What's one way you're different for neurodivergent employees in the onboarding process? How about onboarding those new employees?
Yeah, so again, I would push back on the idea that we need a different process for neurodivergent employees. We see these programs sort of emerging where there's a different process, a recruiting process for neurodivergent employees. Everyone else has an interview, and it's, and then the neurodivergent employees have to go play games and do tests, and that just would you ever do that if you replace neurodivergent employee with employee, job seeker of color? That would obviously be discriminatory and unfair. So I think it's important to have band-aids where you need them. So like even at Ultranauts, we have, I think, 5 or 6 accommodations in place. To us, that's a symptom of a deeper problem, and a red flag waving that, like, hey, somebody's got to redesign a process here because we need an accommodation, and the accommodation's in place only until we fix the problem. It's not a solution. And so onboarding, we have a fairly structured onboarding process for everyone. We've designed that process for neurodiversity, meaning all brain types. One of my colleagues, Nicole Radziwill, who's our chief data scientist and sort of architect of a lot of our systems, because we're designing systems that can scale, that can be kind of reproduced with consistency over time. The onboarding process is designed in the same way, using this design for neurodiversity kind of pedagogy that Nicole has developed. There's a few design pillars around it. One of them is resolving ambiguity. Most onboarding processes, and we're, by the way, we're not perfect at this. We have a lot of work to do, but at least we have some sense of what the gaps are. During onboarding, you're supposed to learn a tool or something. Well, how deeply do I need to learn? How will I apply it, right? Like all this just unknowns creates so much wasted time. And then for some teammates, it can create a lot of anxiety, which can be unproductive and and all the way to harmful. Because if you're new and you don't know what's important, not important, and you don't know what's expected, you combine uncertainty and ambiguity. That's a high anxiety inducing environment, right? So clarity around expectations, designing for resolving ambiguity in that onboarding period, and giving you information that you need at the right sort of sequencing and cadence is really important. The other piece of it is just clarity around not just your role, but what your career path could be. Because a lot of times people's careers are dependent on having an ally, a mentor, who took interest in all this stuff. And we just assume that humans are fallible, and if success of any one employee or teammate depends on their line manager, we have failed. And of course, we'd like to believe we have great line managers who are empathetic and professional, but that's not a system. That's a wish. And so when people join Ultranauts, everyone is set up with what we call a launch pad. It's your 2 to 3 year career trajectory based on your interest that's anchored into the roles and jobs and career paths at Ultranauts. And to do that, we've published fairly specific requirements in terms of not just skills, but levels of different skills. So what is the difference between a level 1 quality engineer in the data practice and a level 2 quality engineer? Can you actually read that description and understand the difference in the benchmarks? So we've published that. That was a bit of a heavy lift, but I would argue that if you don't have that in place, you don't have fair career progression in the company, because you've got to start with, you have clear benchmarks on what's required. The second piece is then, does everyone have the same chance to progress and express their intentions of where they want to be next? And so our launch pads are that artifact that everyone's set up with. And then the third piece of it is the process itself to make, for example, promotion decisions, right? And this took us a few, I think 4 iterations before we got to a place that we feel really good about, that we've actually solved the perennial problem as well as we can, or anybody can, of like, how do you make performance reviews suck less? The answer is don't do them. How do you make promotion decisions more transparent and fair? We figured that one out. And the way we have promotions happen at Ultranauts is we call it community-driven promotions. It sounds a lot scarier than it actually is, but it's essentially remove the single points of failure in the usual system of performance reviews and promotions. So for example, most organizations will have an annual process. You've got a self-assessment, you've got 360 input from the people you've worked with, you have a line manager that's synthesizing that 360 input, and then some opaque connection between that overall assessment exceeds expectations, does not meet expectations, and how promotion decisions actually get made in a closed door room by a management team. This does not sound great because A, some people are harsher than others when they do self-assessments. It can be extremely anxiety inducing for some. B, why do you need the self-assessment anyway, unless you're anchoring the reviews based on that? And that's a cop-out. 2, 360 input reviewers might be great at 1 or 2 things. They're not going to be great at 6 things, and yet they're evaluating the reviewee on 6 things. They might not even know what good looks like on some of those attributes. Why are you relying on a non-expert for a review? 3, the line manager then is magically synthesizing all these different inputs from the reviewers into a single view. No organization has clear heuristics on how to do that. That is ripe with bias. And then you have the disconnect between that whole process and how promotions get made. So we threw the whole thing out. It took us 4 iterations to throw the whole thing out. But we now have a system that, believe it or not, is running in the background. You know, we're quality engineers. We want continuous integration, continuous improvement. And it has a few components. One is, of course, the published benchmarks for every role and every job and every level. So you know what's expected. Second is everyone has a launch pad, which is their trajectory. So they decide, you know, with the L&D team, it's a consultative conversation of like, where do you want to go? What are you passionate about? Where do you see yourself? And then you know where you're trying to get to, and very clear benchmarks on what's required. The third piece is everyone's set up with a portfolio, essentially like an artist portfolio, except it's your professional portfolio, so that when you demonstrate work that's at the benchmark that you're trying to get to, then you document it in your portfolio as evidence, objective evidence that you're doing the work at the thing. And then the final piece is, once you believe you have documented evidence for all the benchmarks required for the job you want to move into, the L&D team sends that evidence out to skill-specific experts who've been identified as endorsers internally, so that the endorser then is simply looking at one, you know, piece of evidence on the skill that they are great at. So they know what good looks like. The community has decided these are the good, you know, these people are the experts, against a clearly published benchmark. So they're just comparing, does A meet B? So we've tried to really limit the bias that, of course, can kick in. I know the person, I've seen their work and all this stuff. And then if either it's yes, you do, or no, and here's precisely why. And so if you get yeses from all the endorsers on all the skills and benchmarks required, guess what? You've decided with expert validation that you are ready for promotion. And the only thing the management team does, besides the edge cases where, well, it's all but one endorser, and which is less than 5% of the cases, all we do is meet once a quarter and decide what we can afford. That's it.
Yeah. That's what it comes down to,
that's
right?
What we should be doing. That's the business decision we should be making. And if we can't afford it, then it's a very transparent conversation with the person impacted to say, look, we acknowledge that you actually are performing at the level that you want to move into. You should be there. here's what needs to happen in the business in terms of specific milestones, or what is the objective criteria that allows us to make the decision, then the business decision to promote you, and some estimate of the time frame it's going to take. And we're super clear about it. And so even if you don't like the answer, let's say the endorsers did not all approve, or the business cannot afford it, it's a much more transparent process, and you have, you sort of achieve this state of procedural justice that allows you to accept a unfavorable response on a highly charged process, right? That's why everybody hates performance reviews. It is a loaded process, so it better be bulletproof as it can be. And so that's what it means to design a fair system that works for all humans. And while the whole promotion thing can sound like it makes sense, but how in the world are we going to implement it in my organization with all these legacy practices? We've started working with a couple of groups. We're not HR consultants, but we also know that if we're going to have an impact beyond Ultranauts that's meaningful, we need to be able to help other organizations implement some of these practices. And the place we're starting is really not at the policy level, like how you do performance reviews, but at the work group level of how do you work with your team and collaborate as a team? Because that's where inclusion happens or not. And that's where people are left out or not. And our definition of inclusion is much more in line with the 20 years of research around this, which is in the workplace, what really matters is the ability and the access someone has to contribute and to participate. That is it. It's not that, how you feel and this and that. And yes, it's correlated with feelings of belonging, but you've got to be super clear of what you're solving for. Because again, we're not an advocacy group. We're a business. We're trying to drive value. And so when you design for inclusion through that lens, you end up with really practical things you can do or change. So we've compiled the library of, I think, about 100 inclusive practices, which obviously is too much for anyone to digest. But we also have simple ways to filter that down for, let's say, a work group of 10. What does your working agreement need to include? And then we have other tools like the biodex that we built for ourselves, which essentially is like the user manual for working with me. It's like a quick start guide for collaborating with your teammate. And it's structured. It's got simple things like how you prefer to receive critical feedback or how you ingest information. And when you have a team of 5 or 10, you have all these different preferences, and you've got some sort of design principles, you could actually construct a meaningful, inclusive environment for that team, regardless of what's happening at the enterprise level, regardless of the policies and the practices. And so the first thing we're going to come out to the world with in terms of the decade of falling on our face and trying to learn how to create a better system is really around this idea of equipping teams to create an inclusive environment for themselves, with some of the tools and the sort of libraries of practices and some analytics and snap surveying to then help the teams check themselves on, are we implementing the things we said we would, and are we improving how inclusive this environment is? Because if you're a team leader, the most frustrating thing about all the rhetoric around DEI is nobody's actually told you how to measure inclusion, or what are you going to implement in your next planning cycle of a sprint or a month or whatever you do, and how in the world do you know if it's working?
Those are valid thoughts, Raj. And I kept thinking as you're going through there, I know that you are taking care of the mental well-being by equipping the worker, and you're taking the system, right? You're taking care of the system at a level that we really should be approaching it at the system level, and then equipping it the worker is the way that I see that, right? So I appreciate all of your content. I can't imagine how many tips are going to come out of this, Rajesh. At the end of this, we're going to have such a great treasure trove of things to show everybody. And really, for me, every time I talk to you about Ultranauts, I'm reassured that we can rework work. We can do things differently. And thank you for being the one to show us that.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Yes. Thanks, everybody. Peace and progress.